As the battle moved forward, and they continued to push towards the center of this massive asteroid field to their destination, the combat raged ever onward, becoming more intense with each passing moment. At this point, one could always hear explosions ringing out in the distance, see them nearby, as the creatures they were fighting were becoming quite ferocious, even in reference to their dealings with them up to this point. It seemed that the closer that they grew to the center, the more fiercely these creatures fought. Delius was doing fairly, taking out large swaths of them, as were his partners in this work. Both Regimen and Jax seemed to be doing fair, despite the intense numbers against them. Regimen was darting about, flying around the massive monstrosity that he summoned, as it fought, snatching one creature after another and engulfing it into one of its countless jaws, the horrifying laughing it gave off as all of its countless eyes peered in every direction, its body moving and shifting in unnatural and horrifying ways. Regimen flew about like a red bullet, leaving a streak of red energy wherever he passed, as yet more red streaks would ring out as he fired that gun of his out at them, targeting enemies that were outside of this creature's range of attack. Jax had become a one-man arsenal, a moving ball of fire and destruction. No longer limited to short bursts, the fire he emitted now was constant. His movement seemed ceaseless, streaks of fire darting from one location to the next as he barreled through enemies, tearing holes right through them, ripping limbs off of their bodies, one after another in rapid succession. His movements were actually beginning to come much closer to Delius's natural movements. They weren't there, but they were getting close. Delius himself continued to fight through the swarms, slashing down one opponent after the next, doing his best to try to shift, learning his new abilities into the mix, beginning to experiment with them one after another, find their limitations, what he could and could not do with them, how often he could use them. And the more Delius began to experiment with these abilities, the more it became apparent that they were growing stronger as they moved towards the center of this system. At first, it seemed as if whenever he used one of the powers, it would only be for a moment or two. Afterwards, the power would simply slip away and be unusable for at least another minute or so. But the time intervals were getting shorter compared to the minute that he started at. The 30 seconds in between the reuse of one of the color-oriented abilities seemed like nothing at all, and yet it was getting shorter with each passing moment, and he was being able to sustain the abilities longer, gaining even more effects. Before, Delius had been receiving short bursts of vision that almost seemed to foretell the movements of enemies, where they were going before they got there. After beginning to learn how to focus and concentrate these energies, manifesting them into abilities, those visions began to appear much more frequently, until they were basically constant. Not only that, as his ability to see these things became clearer and clearer, a new variation was added. He began to notice that when he thought about what actions he would take in response to the movements of his enemies, who to attack first and from where, how, things that usually happen very rapidly, on instinct, through training and skill that he had developed over years. Now, he was beginning to see the course that he would take, or rather, all of the optional choices. Delius began to note that he could watch his own apparition seem to form within the mix, dispersing into multiple the longer that it stretched out. It would start off as one, and after reaching a certain point, it would diverge. Suddenly there would be two, always at a point where there would be a choice. Go right or left, up or down, attack from the side or straight on, dodge or parry. Each one of these premonition versions of himself would take the corresponding action, and then Delius would see the effects. What happened if he took that course of action? As unbelievable as it seemed, Delius became very aware that what he was seeing were future possibilities. He seemed to be peering beyond time to things that had not yet transpired, seeing the course his actions would take and choosing the one that's most beneficial to him. But there was a limitation. Delius noted that the maximum amount of variations he could see past was 7. Each variation seemed to spark off into a different color in the rainbow palette, and after 7 emerged, there would be no more tracing or following of the pattern. It would simply disperse, giving Delius the decision of which one of the paths to follow. 7 alternate timelines, 7 sequences of events, and from those 7, Delius would have to choose one. He even experimented with trying to alter those patterns, to begin following one of the set patterns that he fell into, and then simply trying to do something different midway through it. He found that once this transpired, the cycle would repeat itself. Once again, the duplicates would emerge and begin to divert, showing him a new course, a new path forward in time, and a new choice to make. But this vision of his did not extend forever. After following these multiple sequences of events many times over, Delius found that the limit of how far he could see was exactly 35 seconds. 5 seconds for each color in the rainbow palette. And that with every divergent path he allowed to form, the time would decrease by 5 seconds. If he used all 7 colors in the rainbow palette, he could see a total of 5 seconds into the future, and a complete divergent of 7 alternate paths, while following a single pattern, gave him a full 35 seconds. Strangely enough, as Delius continued to fight, experimenting with all of these new abilities, he couldn't help but wonder what was bringing them on. Why were they suddenly emerging? Is it just the radiation? He thought to himself as he continued to combat the enemies assailing him. One of the bonuses to being able to speed up his perceptions was buying time to think, as the more he speeded up his perceptions, the more so the world around him seemed to slow down. Delius had long since discovered this trick, buying time to think by speeding his senses up to the point where the rest of the world seems to be moving in slow motion. The faster he made it, the slower the world got. So too did his thoughts increase in speed, and so he had much time to think. And the more he did, the more his mind seemed to trail him back to a conversation that he had with Mozuko, speaking with him about how he hadn't been off the planet long enough, that he probably wasn't even fully awake yet, that his powers hadn't come fully to bear, thinking that perhaps that's what's happening. Maybe the radiation simply accelerated the process, bringing all of the abilities that he would have had in time anyways out to full bear all at once. The only question was, could he sustain it? Was this simply an effect of the radiation field that they were fighting in? Or would things remain like this once Delius left? Truthfully, he had no answer for it. Yet, the question rung in his mind still.